Welcome, everybody, to ABL Down on the Farm, Episode 8. Glad you could join us this evening or whenever you happen to be watching it. We are very privileged to have Tyler join the show tonight, who is the owner of the ABL Twins and also a member of our very esteemed executive committee. And the ABL Down on the Farm focuses on all things prospecting, but particularly prospecting in the ABL, which has 20 minor league slots for 30 teams for a very glorious 600 prospects, which gives us a lot to talk about. So I want to bring Tyler in to hear all about his experience, including his experience on the executive committee. So without further ado, here is Tyler. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
No, it's my pleasure, certainly. So we've had Duke on. We've had Jeff on, and now we have you on, and I'm very all members of the executive committee. So, maybe for our audience that is not part of the ABL, and we certainly do have some members of the audience who aren't part of the ABL because of my other league that you're going to be grading in a little while, which I'm very excited about. A little revenge on Dylan for him being on the show earlier in the year. What has it been like to be a member of the executive committee? Because this is your first season as a member of the EC, and maybe describe what the delta has been in terms of responsibilities and all of that you're doing for the ABL. And do you regret it? What's your experience?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and you've potentially heard a little bit from Duke and Jeff, who are much more seasoned in it than I am. I, as you said, the newest owner in the committee, but. No, I mean, my experience has been great. It was certainly not anything I set out to be a part of. I know I've talked to certainly everyone in the executive committee and many other members of the league about how I essentially have quit every other league that I have ever been in because of this league. And so the executive, when they asked me to be on the committee in the first place, it was honestly kind of a joke that was in the chat in year one prior to you even being here.
Right.
Essentially, because I was doing the power rankings back then and just was trying to be involved in the league. Right, there were 29 other guys who I really wanted to get to know and had a similar passion. So it was just kind of a joke in the beginning, and then last year it was Lenny actually who reached out, and they I think just wanted to bring someone else on board who not only could help with the ABL 4 side of things, because I was pretty successful and active in that league as well. But then also just, again, someone else who's active, and it's actually pretty incredible how much goes on at times throughout the year. Sometimes it's slow and not a whole heck of a lot happens, but other times we have a ton to talk about. And so
that's a very finite period you just described. It's slow and not much going on. It's very small.
Exactly.
Very small.
Exactly.
One thing you touched on there is just how many leagues we have within the ABL network. I mean, we on this show talk about the ABL or ABL 1, if you will.
Yeah.
But there's ABL 4. There are a whole bunch of other leagues, and they've been referred to kind of in passing. But it really is a very deep network of people.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you said that struck me was just that you've quit a bunch of your other leagues, right? And I've heard that, and we'll talk about your dynasty experience and what's led you to this point. But what is it about ABL that has led you to that decision to cut bait with what I assume was a real commitment to other leagues that you were in before this? What is it about ABL that's so special to you?
Yeah, I mean, the couple of leagues in particular are ones that Duke and I actually had a lot of conversations about when we were trying to create ABL 4, because a lot of my experience in dynasty leagues actually came with Empire leagues prior to this, where, for those who aren't familiar, essentially half the pot of money from every year goes into an Empire pot. And then whenever one team wins 2 years in a row, not only do they win the money for that year, but then they win all of the money in the Empire pot, and the league resets.
It's kind of like the free parking in Monopoly when you play with the money.
Exactly. Very similar concept. So that was something that I loved. I played in with some friends of mine, and the second that I joined ABL, and it just really just took me, and I loved every part about it, and the even the payout structure, just everything about that was just so amazing. I essentially tried to change my other leagues to it, and no one wanted to do it. And so I was like, all right, well then I don't want to do it anymore. And I grew up playing baseball games where I loved franchise mode, right? Where you could just create everything, be everything, do fantasy drafts, all that kind of stuff. So this is the closest thing to that. And that's why it's the only thing that I really ever want to do in fantasy for the rest of my life, to be honest with you.
There you go. That's a bold statement. That's a lot of runway ahead of you.
Yep.
I mean, because you, unlike me, are still a young guy, so that's good. I mean,
yeah.
I'm one of the older tooth owners in the ABL, so I've been doing this since 1987, so it's quite a long time. But that's great. That's great. So, how much effort are you putting in? Because I know you do all this incredible work with power rankings, and that's really a testament to the ABL generally, that we have so many owners that are willing to take additional time out of their lives, because the ABL itself, just to be an owner, requires an incredible amount of energy if you want to be successful, right?
Yep.
And then on top of that, you have owners doing podcasts, you have people doing power rankings, prospect rankings. You mentioned Lenny; he has his own prospecting angle, and God bless him for that. Still trying to get Lenny on the show. We'll work on that. We'll have a battle of the prospect ranking maybe at some point. So, what's been the additional lift for you? And has your family refused to talk to you anymore?
Oh, my day job is very much a 24-hour type job on my phone a lot of times. And so you take that and then compile ABL and ABL4 on top of that. My wife and I have had conversations many a time about my phone use and how much I'm on there doing stuff. So there's definitely been an extra load, but thankfully year 3 now, you figure out how to balance it. And
right.
And especially even with, EC stuff, the executive committee stuff that we do, sometimes there's stuff on top of that. So being able to balance it is a tough thing to do, but at the same time, now that I'm 3 years in, I feel like I have a pretty good balance of it.
Right. Well, and bless our significant others, right?
Yes.
For putting up with all this nonsense, because my wife refers to herself as a baseball widow, and
very
it's very accurate. And I recognize that it can be extraordinarily annoying. So, my solution has been to give her 100% of whatever pot I win.
There you go. There you go. That sounds great.
And Tiffany's is very happy, and so is she. So
exactly.
So let's jump into some of the topics tonight, Tyler, that I wanted to cover with you. We have a big portion of it that's going to be about the Battle of the Farms, and you have the privilege of being the first ABL owner to actually engage in a Battle of the Farms, where you're going to get to rate systems from another league. But before we delve into that, and by the way, that's going to be a little revenge on Dylan and people from my other dynasty league, one of my other main leagues, when they got to rate you guys, and we'll go back and forth on this all season. So I've got other owners coming on to rank other ABL teams. But I do first want to hear about your prospecting experience and kind of your dynasty evolution, recognizing that now you've limited your exposure to just ABL, which is great. And that's enough. And then at the end of the show, talk about one of my favorite segments, Crushes and Fades, where we talk about prospects that you're either higher or lower on consensus relative to the market. And I'm happy to add some insights about guys that I'm really hot for right now. But let's start first, I think, with just kind of your prospecting and dynasty experience. And what I'm always interested to hear is how it's evolved, and kind of how your approach has evolved, what sources you're relying on now that you didn't rely on before. What's your narrative? What's your story, Tyler?
Yeah, I think, I've been playing fantasy most of my life. I didn't really get into dynasty until probably maybe 10 years ago or so. It was like my first real exposure to it, I would say. And then the Empire Leagues that I mentioned earlier were kind of my first real dive into them, serious leagues, more high stakes type stuff. But the crazy part is again, as I said before, most of those leagues were 12 teams at most. I never really played in bigger leagues because to me at the time, I never really thought they were that enticing. I didn't really feel like, thinking about the 350th ranked prospect as being someone who I would want to care about. It just didn't excite me at the time. And so most of my dynasty or prospecting experience, so to speak, was really, top 100 guys, like the guys that were essentially close, or at least maybe if they weren't top 100, they were close ETA, right? Like they were coming up soon, they were going to have an impact, that kind of stuff. So really, I don't have a whole lot of history from the prospecting side of things. And there were, I know a lot of people, especially in year one of ABL, who were talking about the ridiculousness of knowledge of some of the people in this league in terms of how much they know about that 350th ranked prospect who I have never heard of before. And so very quickly, I kind of had to up my game and, find some resources to start out with. I think like a lot of people, I started by just using lists, right? Finding different lists that were out there. And now I feel like I have it a little more fine tuned to my own. So, I'll use some lists every now and then. And like the whole Baseball America thing, that was never something that I really took into account because they didn't, they weren't necessarily huge into fantasy for a long time. So I never really thought about them, but now I use them a ton. And so it's very interesting how it's kind of evolved from that very shallow end to now being in the deep end.
Yeah, so I do have some follow-up questions about that, but I wanted to make an observation about Baseball America. So everybody who comes on the show, and I'm a big advocate of Baseball America. They're amazing.
Yeah.
Everybody talks about the influence it's had on them.
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things that happens with Baseball America is that it has not historically, as you said, been a fantasy baseball focused publication. They now do have fantasy baseball content, and that's a recent thing that they've tried to reach out and branch out and expand their universe. But I think in Dynasty, what people have focused on is they provide a very specific value because they do this deep dive on prospects, right? And it almost doesn't matter that they're not fantasy focused, right? Yeah. There are things you can do to filter out some information, like you don't care so much about fielding.
Yeah.
Unless it relates to playing time.
Yeah.
And, there are other things you can think about, like, as a real baseball fan versus a fantasy baseball fan, that you kind of differentiate prospects on. But there is real value in that. And, how did it kind of open your eyes, or to what extent did it open your eyes about prospecting and thinking about value of prospects within the Dynasty community?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been using it for nearly as long as everyone else has. So I would certainly still consider myself very naive in terms of understanding the true wealth of knowledge that is on their website. I still to this day go to their website and I'm like, man, what do I want to sift through now type of thing? It's just because there's so much there. It's just an awesome amount of stuff. But I would say, honestly, the biggest impact it's had for me has been one, I think the fantasy side of things and just their fantasy articles in general, having it be a quick read in the sense, or a quick skim through is really nice. Because for the most part, when if you go out and try to find lists, it's either you get the top 500 list or you're reading like a 2-page article about one person. And it's just like, I just kind of want a recap of stuff. Right. And so I think they do a really good job of that. And then on top of that, there's lots of guys especially in the banter channel who talk about all these crazy baseball stats all the time and what they like and what they don't like and all this kind of stuff. And again, naive, not knowing as much about those stats as a lot of other people, it's really opened my eyes to be able to kind of see, okay, this, maybe for this position, this statistic is kind of more important. And then, I go and equate that to ABL and how does that score points and et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Do you think it's deepened your appreciation for baseball, this experience of kind of hearing what other people like in terms of fantasy? How is that? Is there a crossover for you?
I don't know. I've always loved baseball, I've always just loved it in general. I was someone who didn't want the games to be faster just because I liked baseball. You know what I mean? I guess I didn't really care either way because baseball was baseball, but I'm, if anything, I guess I would say, yes, it's 100% deepened my appreciation even more, even though I didn't really think it could be deepened because I just love the game of baseball and I love how fantasy delves into that. A quote I'll never forget from my brother, actually, who also, him and I grew up playing fantasy. We've been in a ton of leagues together and all this kind of stuff. And we've always been football people. grew up playing football. Neither of us actually played baseball for most of our lives. We maybe played until sixth grade, seventh grade, and then stopped. So we were always fantasy football guys. But once we got into the dynasty side of things, he instantly said, he came to me and he's like, if I had to choose one, I would drop football in a heartbeat, and it's not even close. And it's just something where baseball just does that to you. And then you have the fantasy side, which only elevates that.
Right. Sure. And going back to the lists that you mentioned when you first started kind of delving into this, are there any lists that you initially found to be particularly useful, and has your view about them kind of softened as time has gone on, and why?
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone's used Prospects Live at some point. I feel like they're one of the most popular fantasy lists out there. In This League is another one. I can't remember exactly who runs that. But that was a really good list that I actually used early on. There was the reason I liked that list was because they provided little blurbs about every player and why they ranked them certain places, which I kind of, again, liked to be able to do. And then there's another one. Brick Wall is another one, which I think a lot of people have used as well, which, again, he's been around for a long time. Very good resource. So I think those three were probably the ones early on that were my big ones. Now it kind of ironically, I don't use lists. Not that I've softened on them necessarily, because I think they have value, right? To just kind of create a board, so to speak, you want to.
Sure.
But I use a lot of like social media resources now.
Like what? What kind of like resources? You don't have to be specific if you don't want to. What kind of? How do you like categorize it?
I'm all about sharing, because some stuff I agree with, some stuff I don't. So the more resources out there, the better. But I mean, Twitter's a huge one. There's just some different accounts that and different random people. To be honest with you, I don't even know half their names. I just follow them because they give.
Sure, you see the headline and you're like, oh,
yeah, exactly. Well, and they just they give good resources on minor league guys, or they follow certain leagues or certain teams or whatever it might be. And so I really have upped my baseball game on Twitter, so to speak, because I feel like I've gotten a lot of good information there. And then, I mean, Instagram's pretty good too. TikTok's pretty good too. So I try to follow certain accounts on those as well. But Twitter's been a huge. I've found some really good stuff on Twitter.
Yeah, no, look, there are a lot of amazing resources on Twitter. I'm not on Instagram or TikTok, but Twitter is something for baseball news generally that I follow. And I get alerts, from them every day, or constantly. My wife makes fun of me all the time for the amount of Twitter feeds that come through. But there are a tremendous number of scouts on Twitter that I particularly like to follow, and all over the world.
Yeah.
Right. But particularly in Latin America.
I was just gonna say Dominican League and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's some there's a deep bench of scouts there. Yeah. And I follow all those guys, or as many as I can. I'm sure I'm not following all of them, but I follow a lot. And they're Imaginary Brick Wall and Baseball America. I'm a big fan of Baseball HQ as well. But there are individual writers for that. Fangraphs, there are writers for that I follow. And they're all wonderful resources. You can kind of sift through the information. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but over time I've kind of evolved into having my own philosophy about prospects, and I just have my own things that I value, and I have my own rankings now. And they're not even rankings; they're just ratings more than anything else, and values I place on players. And for you, like, how has that process been? Have you kind of like changed in terms of how you view players or value them? And maybe it's even ABL specific, right? Because of the scoring system in our league.
Yeah. Well, and I know I shared with you kind of prior to, but ABL was my first experience with a points league. Mm-hmm. And so how I viewed prospects, even just from coming from Roto to points, was incredibly different. I personally, and right or wrong, I don't know, because again, there were 12-team leagues, but I used to value pitching so much in Roto leagues, just because I felt like if you could find one or two that came up and just were consistent, it was such a game changer. But I also found on moving to points that it can, especially in a team, a 30-teamer like this, it can be such a crapshoot with a lot of things. And so it seems like over 3 years, hitters have been more consistent and easier to hit, in a sense, so I feel like it's maybe changed that way. But then it's also been influenced by points. There's certain things that I look for, like strikeout percentage, for example, and sort of strikeout to walk percentage, for example, is something that I never really looked at a ton. And now it's like one of my number one things that I look at every hitting prospect, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just interesting how even statistics that I looked at, 4 or 5 years ago are now things that I could care less about. And other things.
Right. So, everybody who's come on the show, or almost everybody, has talked about K minus walk ratio for pitching, right? And strikeout percentage for hitters and walk percentage. And, some people have talked about, RWC and, ISO and other metrics that, they like to focus on. And all those are fair, right? And, when you first started getting into roto, I mean, if you were like most of us, like, you had no idea what these stats were, right? It's like, what? I'm going to, what is ISO, right? But now you become well versed in them, right? And, has that changed in any way how you value or view major league players in real life?
I would say no, not as much. And that's because with the major league players, there's a lot more to consider than just the stats, right?
Sure.
Like with contracts and whether it's length, whether it's price. I even think positionally, it's really, really important in the majors, like what positions people play, whereas in the minors, it literally doesn't matter, right? Until they get to the majors. And even then, if you have a really good prospect who plays a position you don't necessarily need, well, then you flip them for something, right? So and it's easy to do that with a top prospect. So I think I would say a lot less in the majors than the minors.
All right, that's fair. I mean, I think it's interesting. I don't know if you focus too much on the minor league prospects position. I tend to draft a lot of shortstops on the hitter side and center fielders, because they tend to be the best athletes on the field, right? Usually. And I figure, wherever they end up on the diamond later on in life, whether it's right field, left field, or second base or third base, where the shift, they're pretty good athletes, right? So if by default I'm picking them when they're 18, 20, whatever they are, like, that's kind of my focus. So position matters to me to some extent, but you're correct that at the major league level that it matters a lot more. I mean, they're getting paid to make a living there, and there's real value in run prevention. Whereas in fantasy you don't care so much about that from a hitter's perspective. Obviously for pitching you do, but I think that some of these ratios that we're focused on in fantasy have influenced my thinking about value for hitters and pitchers. But I think you're correct. At least in my experience, it's not to the same extent that it impacts my valuation of them as fantasy assets.
And I would say too, to your shortstop center field statement, like I completely agree. And again, this is just my thinking about it. I completely agree. If they're in that 21, 22-year-old age and they've been in the minors and they're sticking at shortstop and center field, it's probably because they are the best athletes, right? It's, for me personally, it's really hard for me to draft an 18-year-old shortstop when maybe some other metrics aren't there, right? Whereas for me, the two things that I look at, honestly, for young players, especially 18, 19-year-olds, I look at height and weight.
Oh, interesting.
As someone who was I have a background in strength and conditioning and stuff too. And so the best athletes that I saw, whether it was football, basketball, whatever, were the guys who had a really good ratio from height to weight, right? They weren't, super tall and super skinny or super short and super fat. They were the guys who were, 6'1", 210.
Right. So this is fascinating to me, Tyler. This is fascinating. So I place a lot of emphasis on height and weight for young prospects. I do too. I do not have a strength and conditioning kind of background. I'm all of like 5'9", 162. So so it's not, I'm not a big dude, but so I'm very interested to hear about your view of this issue, and I'm happy to share mine, which I've expressed, on and off in different episodes. But what are you looking for in that height, weight ratio, and you may be looking at even more than that in terms of body mass or whatever it is. But like, tell me what you're looking at and why.
Yeah. So specifically I won't go through position by position, but I'll just generalize to say like outfielders, for example. If they're 18, 19 years old, I really don't care if they're, they've mainly played left field or mainly played center field or whatever. I'm more so looking at, do they have a frame that they can build into that will allow them to last in the outfield? Because a lot of times you see guys that have played in the outfield because they have a huge arm, but they're honestly stature-wise not great for the outfield. They end up getting moved, and a lot of times it's like third, right? Because they can still use that big arm from third. It's just they don't have to run everywhere in the outfield. Yep. I look in the outfield, a frame that you can grow into. So someone who's, really 6 feet would be great. Something like 6 feet, 6'1", something like that, and at least 185, 190 at minimum, just so that they can again grow into that frame a little bit more, put some muscle on.
Right. And if you figure if they're already 6 feet, 185 at 18.
Exactly.
Right.
You're in a good spot.
It's what the scouting community calls a projectable frame.
Yes.
Right. When you start reading about that in Baseball America, you're like, oh, he's a very projectable frame.
Yes. And who knows, too, they could still grow, right? Like, especially get another inch or two, and that's even better then, right?
Yeah. Right. 100%. And, does it influence your thinking in terms of like middle infield positions?
Yeah. So the first base and third base, which I know you just mentioned middle, but first and third, I don't really take a lot of consideration. Those are probably the two positions I care the least about when it comes to height and weight, because so many of them are the exact same. Very few of them get moved out of those positions. And if they do, a lot of times it's just to the other one. So, there's not a whole lot of reason or rationale to. Second base and short, though, for sure. Yeah. I think, typically you see shortstops tend to be a little bit taller than second baseman, just on average. They also tend to be, again, because they're athletes, they're also usually a little more built, maybe have a little bit more to them. So shortstops that are like 5'10", 170 don't interest me at all. Second basemen who are over 200 pounds don't interest me, because they're just, and not because they're not necessarily a good player, but I know they're not going to stick there, and I don't want to draft them if I don't know where they're going to play or what they're going to be. I'd rather take a wait and see approach, and if they end up being a great prospect, cool, then maybe I'll try and trade for them. But I'd rather find the guy who I think like, okay, he fits this position. The team is going to keep him there, develop him there, etc. They're not going to try to move him all over the place where he's got to learn 3 or 4 different positions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the player you just described sounds like a utility infielder. Yeah. Right.
Essentially.
And not that there's anything wrong with that as a major league career, but like as a prospect, not very valuable.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. I'll trade for him down the road.
Yeah, exactly. So I have a very similar approach to hitters in terms of their size and weight. And, I'm looking, for a height ratio that makes sense in terms of their build and their position. And there are certain outfielders, for example, who, when I see their listed weight is like, 5'9", 148. I'm like, I'm not betting on that. It's like, because like that's like a featherweight, and I'm not really interested, right? I mean, because you're not going to be a thumper at the major league level at that weight. I mean, maybe you have a growth spurt. Maybe you're like Michael Jordan, who
that's your company, right?
Right. I mean, but like there are a couple like guys in the DHL right now who are like 17 years old, who are very hot prospects on lists right now. And I look them up and I see what their height and weight is. I'm like, I have no interest. There are a couple I've seen, like their names are getting circulated, and I've seen them picked up in various leagues. And I'm like, oh, you mean that 5'9", 148 guy? No, I'm not interested. Right?
I'm good.
Yeah, because he's not making the majors. And if he does, it's going to be as a backup player. Yeah. But guys who are like at 17, 6'2", like 180, like
yes, please.
That guy interests me.
Yes,
yeah, right. And then there are always like outliers, like O'Neal Cruz being gigantically tall and like just
always
ridiculous athlete, right? But the exceptions are always out there.
Yeah.
What about pitching?
Yeah. So I feel like the general consensus is always, if you're a little bit taller of a pitcher, and you have and this is kind of something maybe that's personal to me, but I don't know. But someone who's stocky, I like. And stocky can mean a few different things, I guess. But I don't mind a pitcher who is a little maybe on the heavier side. I don't, because usually what that means is even if they're on the heavier side and they're younger, they'll work that off once they get, into a real conditioning program.
Right.
I'm not really worried about that, but what that probably means is they have a pretty good frame. And a lot of times, again, you get the lanky guys who maybe are taller or who are just average height, but they got the long arms or whatever. It seems to be like those guys are the ones who tend to have the injuries, or they tend to be relief pitchers down the road or whatever it might be. The guys who seem to have decent build, and again, I keep referencing kind of this same realm, but the 6'1", 200s are, yep. I would love anyone who's around there. Younger guys usually aren't there yet. So anyone who's 5'11 plus and 175, 180 plus, would be good for me. I think taller can be better, but it's not necessarily taller from a lengthwise perspective. Like I don't want tall and lanky. I want tall and
right. You don't want Tristan McKenzie necessarily, exactly. Right? But exactly. You might not mind somebody like Randy Johnson.
Exactly. I hope Brendan's watching, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, so
that was a great shot right there.
Yeah. So there's a lot of durability questions that come with pitchers that are too small in terms of their height. So the guys who are 5'10", 5'11", there can be outliers, right, where these guys succeed, or even 6 feet, but they tend to be bad bets maybe in terms of hedging, right? In terms of their ability to stick in the rotation, not have, injuries flare up, because pitching's hard. It's bad on your body, right? And you need guys who can really endure it. Yep. So, I do like those guys who are, 6'2", 235, when they're young, right? That's a good weight and size. But I do have a soft spot in my heart for guys who are 6'8" and throw really, really hard. I like big, tall pitchers who throw really hard. So guys like Yuri Perez, I'm a huge fan of. Noah Schultz is a guy I love. And I target those guys in drafts. And maybe that's just me channeling the pipe dream of having another Randy Johnson on my team.
Yeah,
but
right.
But those are kind of the two sizes that I look for. And I certainly eliminate, rightly or wrongly, I eliminate a lot of prospects who don't meet that criteria. Yep. Because I'm not willing to hedge bet that way.
Yeah. It's not the, again, metrics wise, it's not the best thing for you to do, because it just, those guys probably are not going to amount to anything. And maybe there will be some, but not many.
Yeah. And that highlights a point, right? I mean, Tyler, no model is perfect in terms of predicting what these guys are going to do, right? I mean, we can all be wrong. It's fallible, right? But it's a matter of hedging your bets and where are you willing to commit your resources, right?
Well, I think a lot of people don't want to be wrong, right? They want to hit every prospect, and I think that's where a lot of people make mistakes. Is it's like you have to be willing to be wrong. You have to be willing to miss on guys because you wanted to not miss on these other guys.
I mean, I think embracing the uncertainty is part of the process, right? And just living with the mistakes, and sometimes they can be well thought out decisions, and they just end up being wrong, right? You're like, oh no, it didn't work out for whatever reason. But if you have a process that you believe in, and you stick to it, hopefully over time, you come out ahead. Right. Right. Well, that's great. Look, you're the first person I've had on the show that really kind of aligns with me on height and weight. So that's exciting for me. And I just started my draft prep for 2024. Okay. And so one of the very first things I do is take the players off of Baseball America for the draft and start listing their weight and heights, and then reevaluating where they rank for me right on the board, right? And most of these guys are 18 or 21 or whatever it is, right? So to me, that's a key metric. I look at a lot of other things too, of course, but there are definitely these two columns in my spreadsheet every year that I place a lot of emphasis on, and I'll put notes in the side not only is he 235, but he's good muscle mass because I read some scouting report on him, right, or whatever it is. So that's great. So let's talk. Let's shift gears and talk about this battle of the farms.
Awesome.
Okay, so I just want to tee this up. So this is something I have been excited to do with the show and just have owners from different leagues rating rosters in the other league. And so I had Dylan on from my other Major League Dynasty League, which is riffing off of the movie Major League Baseball, Major League itself. And that is a 16-team league where we have 30 minor league spots, and it is 5x5 roto scoring, but with OPS instead of batting average. Okay, so the rosters look very different than they are in ABL. There are contracts in that league, so there is some similarity in terms of the financial structure, but the salary cap is completely different, and the waiver wire budget is completely different. So there are a lot of differences as well. But I do think it's an interesting comparison because there are 480 prospects rostered in that 16-team league as opposed to our 600 in ABL. So if you looked at these rosters, which I showed you, I'll put on the screen in a hot minute, they're going to look different than an ABL roster, and that's okay. They'll look stronger in terms of their depth. But so I'm very interested to hear what you think of these two different rosters, and I picked two owners who I think are very good prospectors, and so you shouldn't feel shy about rating them or blasting one of them. They're both solid owners. So definitely interested in hearing your thoughts, but I'm interested to know a little bit about what you did to prepare for the Battle of the Farms, and what analysis you brought to the table before we turn to the actual rosters themselves.
Yeah, so I kind of I'm referencing my second monitor here, so if I'm looking off the screen, so I essentially looked at each system and just kind of gave a first reaction, and looked at names that just immediately stood out to me, whether because they're good or I know them or whatever, and then just kind of made a note about that, and then essentially just kind of checked in on some other notables that I personally don't know a ton about, but just in doing some research about them, obviously seemed pretty good. And then I just made some basic notes about each team in general. And then I also went through, and I have, as everyone else does, I have my own kind of curated ranking system or list or whatever you want to call it. And so I kind of went through each list and just averaged the ranks of both teams. So I kind of have a total average, and then I have an average of what I consider just like star averages. So I have 0-star prospects, 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, and then 4 and 5-star together.
All right. Well, I'm certainly interested in hearing about various prospects on this team that receive grades of 1-star, 2-star, 3, or 4. But let's put the rosters on the screen. And hopefully this won't slow up the audio. But, tell me your first impressions of these two rosters. I've labeled them Team A and Team B. I know which owners own each team, but you obviously do not. So what were your initial reactions? What's your overall assessment? Share your thoughts.
Before I do that, do you mind zooming in just a little bit on the Excel?
I can try to do that.
Go for it. Otherwise, I'll reference over here if I need to. I was just going to.
Yeah, I can do that. So thank you for telling me that the screen sucks.
No,
there you go. Is that better?
Yes,
there you go.
So my initial thoughts. I'll just start with Team A. My initial thoughts were the kind of the prospects that stood out to me initially on the list were Noel, Lee, Leonard, Adele, Burdick, Pages, and Patino. And the reason that they stood out is all of them were familiar names to me and what I believe to be pretty familiar names to most people, I would think. Most have at least been on the radar for a while, if not, a long while. So that was kind of the first thing that stood out to me. And then some other notables on the list. Rodriguez on there, I thought was an interesting notable. He's kind of been getting a little bit of heat here and there, at least from what I've been reading. I think it's Celestin is how you say it.
Yep.
I knew nothing about him, which apparently I should have, because he seems to be a lot of people like him right now. And then Lyle and Laperfido, I think too. Lyle I'd heard of. Laperfido I had never heard of before either. So two higher end, what I felt like prospect, top 200 guys at least. who I didn't really know much about. So
let's pause there for 1 second, Tyler, because like this is it's interesting to me because we all like have our different likes and dislikes. So I'm a big, J15 guy.
Yeah.
Right? So Stelliston is a guy like I know very, very well. Right.
Yeah.
Other owners are a little tepid about getting into those waters, and so they're not as focused on those players, right? And I think that there is a market for owners who are willing to invest and take the risk in being in the J15 pool of snagging guys like Felton Stelliston, right?
Yeah.
And a guy who is on the other team, Jackson Churio, falls into that very camp, right?
Yep.
Who at age 16 was a J15.
Yep.
Nobody paid attention to, and now obviously he's a hot prospect. He's actually struggling a little bit this year, but so that's always interesting to me. And it's also interesting that there are guys on this roster, in a 16-team league with only 480 prospects that could still fall below the radar, right, of somebody who's in a 30-team league who's very focused on prospect, right? So it's just it's a testament to how different owners do their homework and find diamonds in the rough, or at least potential diamonds in the rough.
Yeah.
Right. And it goes to the, motto of the show, which is always be prospecting. Right. So like this is great. Right. The team A has found a couple guys that another sophisticated owner wasn't focused on, but now maybe you are.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
right?
it's something where I don't look at every prospect. Like we went through even a top 200 list. I'm not going to know everyone on that list because there are, as we just talked about for 20 minutes, there are just certain prospects that for whatever reason, right, I just don't care about. I would say I focus on J15 just as equally as anything else from a prospecting perspective. Mm-hmm. But for whatever reason, didn't focus on him, right? And so I think to your point, it's like, and I don't remember what my thought process was a year ago or whatever, whenever I was doing the J15 stuff. But I just, for whatever reason, it wasn't someone who at the time I was interested in.
Right.
And I won't foreshadow anything later when we talk about, some guys that we're going to, or that we really, really like, or that we're really high on. But shortstop was not necessarily a position I felt like I needed to invest highly in. So that very well could have been a reason why I didn't look at him as much as, say, other positions. But yeah, so that it's just, you bring up a great point. And that's something I am more than willing to say is I prospect in my own way and in a very particular way. And if guys don't fit that mold, I don't really care what everyone else thinks. I'm not going to look at them.
Yeah. Well, there's something to be said for that too, is having conviction in your process and what you want to be doing, and having that confidence, actually follow through on it. And I think that's actually a natural progression of not following these lists and being wedded to the lists, and trusting the process. To borrow the 76ers, motto, right? So I interrupted you, Tyler, in terms of your assessment. So please continue.
No, that's okay. You want me to keep going on Team A, or you want me to go to Team B?
Yeah, whatever you want to talk about. Yeah, I'm interested in hearing your full analysis of these two rosters.
Okay, so I'll just finish up, I guess, what I had for A, because I don't have a ton left for them. But the few bullet points I just had for Team A in general were, it seemed like a more heavier, close ETA approach, or even players who have already had some time, like Adele, for example.
Yep.
It seemed like a higher focus on that, which honestly in a 16-team league is probably a good way to go, right? If you have less teams, you want guys who are going to come up, and especially as you mentioned before, you're using contracts too. So I don't, again, know what the contract situation is like, but my assumption would be less teams means the more people you can have come up and be cheaper, the more competitive you can be with buying bigger names, et cetera. So, so that was something I noticed. I also kind of thought it was just in general a safer lineup of prospects in general. Not necessarily good or bad. I just thought it was safer, again, with that closer ETA. These are guys that may not be the biggest out there, but they're going to debut. They're going to play. They're probably going to get some time. So I thought it was a little bit safer. And then I haven't gotten to the star side of things yet, but kind of their 1- and 2-star prospects where I had them put in, which are kind of the lowest ranked prospects that I had. Some of them are former 3-star plus prospects that have kind of fallen down my list a little bit. So
right.
That was kind of a more negative on that side for Team A.
Right. One guy you didn't message before you go to Team B. I'm just curious if there's a reason you haven't mentioned him. Was Brooks Lee.
So,
which is actually one of your guys, right? Because I know you're a Twins
love
guy.
him. So he was the guy I mentioned. He was the second guy. My first reaction, I saw him and was just kind of like, all right, he's on there. I obviously know him. I love him. I hope he's great, but I'll foreshadow a little bit in saying that he won't be the direct target of my, I guess, downers when it comes to prospects specifically, but there will be a theme when it comes to that he will be involved in. So
I see. All right.
I love him. Obviously, a lot of people like him. He's still young. I hope he's, the next coming of anything good in the major leagues. But I purposefully did not say a ton about him because of that.
Okay, fair enough. So Team B.
Team B. So first reaction, guys I saw that I like or know of, Alcantara, obviously both Cheerios. Is it, I don't know if it's Pereira. I should ask Brendan. He probably knows how to say it. Or Pereira. I know I've heard him a bunch, but I've never heard his name pronounced.
Pereira,
yeah. And then Vaquero and Rocker. Obviously are two bigger names there as well. So for me, those names just in general, kind of higher end, big time names that a lot of people know. And then this team also had a solid foundation of hitters in general. This was part of our conversation, I know, prior to the show as well, about if there was a more of a, I guess, emphasis on pitching versus hitting or whatever it was, because both of these systems have a ton of hitters and not as many pitchers. So that was something that I brought up as well. But a couple of notes, or I guess other guys I noticed on there as well that I liked. Ramos. I don't know. Is it Dancon? I'm not sure. That's how you say it, I think. Triantos, Gentry, Gutierrez, Lara, and Madden, all good prospects who I thought were notables on there as well.
What about Triantos for a second? Because he's actually an interesting prospect, and the owner of this particular team, just by way of backstory, he's a big fan of Triantos. Okay, and I traded him Triantos for Carlos Jorge because Carlos Jorge is one of my guys. And it's not that I don't like Triantos, but I'm interested to hear what about him caught your attention.
Yeah, so guy that I saw on a lot of lists kind of when he was first coming out, guy who I felt like had a lot of helium when he was first coming out. Still, I think from a basic skill set perspective has the means to be able to make it to the majors and be a contributor. But I do think it's maybe less than what people originally thought. I am by no means an expert on him, but that's kind of the reason I put him on there is one, because I saw him a lot last year, just in a lot of different things. But then reading this year, it seems like are softening on him a little bit. So that's one of the reasons I put him on there as a notable.
Got it. Any other notes or observations before we get to your final verdict?
Yeah. So I said the high end guys are awesome, but there are a decent amount of unknowns that I had no clue about, never heard of before. As opposed to kind of the safer look on Team A, this guy seems to have much more of a high risk, high reward side of things. Vaquero coming to mind with that, such a high risk, high reward guy. Seems like Rocker too, same kind of concept. And then from another star note, so to speak, this roster technically had a lot more 3-star type prospects, which are like the maybe 200 to 300 type guys. And then I also believe the 4 and 5-star guys, the high end guys, are better than the 4 or 5-star guys on the other team as well.
Got it. And you referring to like Jackson Chourio and those kind of dudes? Yeah. All right. I get it. So in your final analysis, which roster would you rather have?
So I think the interesting part about this is I look at both of them, and if I could have them both in ABL, that would be great. I would be more than happy.
It'd be fine.
But knowing that obviously isn't the case in a 16 teamer, or really anywhere below that, I would choose Team B. And simply because, as I referenced earlier, I feel like if you can hit 2, 3, 4 of these higher end guys and have them come up, especially in a contract league, that can be such a big deal. Playing time is great and close ETA is great, but is John Kenzie going to get time in Cleveland, and is he really going to do anything else but hit 220 homers every year?
Right.
And again, Brooks Lee I'll get to, but Adele, who knows if he comes up and can translate it to the majors, maybe. Burdick was a great prospect at one time and now is not, I guess. So there's a lot of close ETA guys, Pages being another one.
Yep.
So personally, Team B, just simply because I feel like it's more profitable long-term to have those high-end guys hit than it is to have kind of a bigger stable of safer guys.
Got it. That's very interesting. Let me give you a little background on the two owners and where they are in the league, right? So Team A is owned by Dylan, who was on the show a couple weeks ago. And Dylan is one of the top teams in the league. He was like in the running for the championship last year. So he has a very much a win now roster.
Sure.
Right, which somewhat explains the proximity of his prospects, right? Totally. So in many respects, his roster is built to aid that endeavor. All right. And Dylan, as we saw on the show, is a prospector, and he's going to hunt for some gold, and he's got some names here which have good value.
Yeah.
Right. But he's definitely tempered it to meet his roster needs.
Very much so. That would have been my guess. So
yeah. So Team B is owned by my good friend Tom, and Tom I'm in multiple leagues with. ABL is the only dynasty league I'm not in with him, and Tom is a very, very shrewd prospector. He took over this team, and blew it up. Because it was an abandoned team, much like we've seen in the ABL when people come in and take over, a neglected roster, let's call it.
Yep. So,
he very much kind of just was playing for the future, which again mirrors kind of your analysis, right? I mean, so a lot of these guys on this roster he acquired, and these rosters I kind of froze in time before Tom just made another big trade. So he actually has more prospects than are on this list. He upgraded again, right? So you don't have the benefit of that. But it kind of, is an interesting, to me at least, a juxtaposition of where people are in their current major league roster versus how they're pursuing the future.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's an interesting narrative about that. And you see that frequently. I think even in the ABL, you'll see that kind of carry over in terms of how teams are constructing things. And the question is, like, how soon can Tom compete? Right.
Yeah.
And, is that 2 years, 3 years? Like, can he do enough at the major league level to make this roster competitive right away? When does Jackson Churio come up?
Yeah.
Right. Those kind of questions. Alcantara's, that's one of his guys.
Yeah.
Like I can tell you, I in another league we were in, I got Alcantara and Jordan Walker from him in a deal.
Wow.
That was like pulling teeth. Right. Because in that league he's trying to win now. And I wasn't. So we were able to pull that trade off. But he is, very, very shrewd. He's actually one of these guys that, and I've told him this, like before the draft in any of my dynasty leagues, one of my last checks is to see which guys are on Tom's roster that aren't on my board yet. And I'm like, because I want to know what those guys are.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. I think it's something too where, and again, I don't know the state of the league and the teams and stuff like that, but yeah, the goal is always to, have the best farm system you can while also be competing. Right. And
we can't all be Duke
all the time.
We can't all be Duke. So it's
exactly. We can't all be competing and have the best farm system at the same time. Now that Harry is like departed the league, we have a dormant best farm system. Yeah. It'll be very interesting to see what happens.
Yeah. So we'll see what happens with that. But we'll see if Duke has the three-peat. But we're all waiting with bated breath. But those are National League problems, not American League problems. Like
very much so.
So let's talk, Tyler, a little bit about your crushes and fades. This is one of my favorite things about the show is like talking about, loves and dislikes. So, you can start with either category that you'd like to, crushes or fades, but I'm very interested to hear what you think.
Well, if I'll ask if it's all right. My biggest crush, who is still my biggest crush now, but has been my biggest crush for 2 years, ever since he was taken. So he has a ton of helium now. He's one of the highest rated prospects, but I was super high on him when he first came in and was like maybe a 200, 300, 400 type guy. But it's Junior Caminero. And this guy came out and when you look at him, if you look at statistically, but then you look at, some height and weight stuff, even, I just kind of liked him from where he was in the beginning. And I know shortstop, as you're saying, that was something that I had focused on at the time. But man, I love this kid. He has done everything at every level so far. So I am so hopeful. I hate the fact that he's in Tampa, but I hope that he potentially either somehow makes it there and is, the next Wander Franco, but better.
Right.
Or he gets moved in some kind of deal.
Let's pause on that comment for just a hot second, because Tampa's a very interesting organization.
Yeah.
They are extremely successful at identifying talent and developing it at the minor league.
Very.
Right. But then they get to the majors, then they get platooned or whatever, because they have this whole like advanced Moneyball theory that like it frustrates fantasy owners. And is that what you're referring to when you say you hate the fact that he's in Tampa?
Yes, because I have owned every, and really it's even more so just like second base shortstop prospects, because I have owned every second base and shortstop prospect in some league that Tampa has had in the past 5 years. And Cooper Kinney is another one who I think of, who just plays well, does well in the minors, and then is pushed up, and then all of a sudden you kind of hear like small things come out where it's like, oh, he's playing second base, but he's also playing something else, or he's
right.
They're testing him in right field, or like and I'm like, you have to be kidding! They're doing it with another prospect, so that's why I'm hoping he's maybe good enough where they won't do that with him, and
or they'll trade him.
Or they'll trade. I would love for them to trade him.
Although the risk there, if there's an adage in baseball that you don't trade with the Rays. True. Right? Because if they're getting rid of somebody, you're like, what's wrong with this guy?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
They know more than we do.
Yeah, they've consistently traded away almost all the lows. By the time we're done, there'll be no lows on that team, even though they've had all three of them at one point, right?
Yep.
So that's interesting. So who else? You got Caminero as one. I get that.
Yeah. So he was kind of the big one, and then a couple of. Hold on, I'm trying to pull up the. I'm just kind of taking them from my roster because they're just guys who I've had crushes on. So, Encarnacion Strand was another one.
Sure.
Who, obviously, Twins guy. I was high on him from the beginning. He's obviously, hopefully, will come up and play with the Reds soon. He's been great. And then another one, I'm trying to think of, I'll say my last kind of crush, so to speak. I had a couple from this year's draft class, so I'll go a little bit more recent. But Ryan Clifford out in Houston.
Oh, sure.
He
big power hitter.
Yeah, it felt like he didn't have a ton necessarily of helium, like pre-draft, coming out into it. But then for whatever reason, like a month or so coming up into the draft, people were just like all about him. I saw him everywhere. So, and I think I can't even remember. I should look when I drafted him. I don't know if they have that in here. Yeah, I got
the draft results. Yeah, they'll be in there.
Yeah, I got him at the end of the second round, which I was thrilled with. I could not believe that he fell that far, because I look at him and again the power side of things, and I'm like, man, if this guy sticks in center potentially, if he can build the frame out, he could be an absolute dude out there.
And it's interesting in ABL, for example. We have specific outfield slots. Some leagues don't, so the position actually matters for us.
Correct.
And I certainly focus on power and speed for my players on offense. Because of the scoring system, I'm less concerned, not unconcerned with hit ratios and strikeout ratios, but you can generate points so quickly with home runs and stolen bases.
Correct.
And also, if they can walk a little bit, that's really
Walks are
nice.
huge.
Yeah, but guy he's got some power.
Yeah.
If you got that thump in the middle of the line, that 70 raw power or whatever it is, he's an interesting guy. I get that. I get that. So what about some of your fades?
So fades for I don't know. Again, I don't know if this counts, but I'll give you a couple of years ago fade that I had. I have always faded Grayson Rodriguez.
Okay.
I have never, and maybe it's a pitching thing. I don't know. I don't know that there's any pitching prospects I've ever loved. I've never had a Yuri to love before, like you do. I've never.
He's my Whitney Houston, baby.
I've never felt that way on a pitcher ever. So I was just never down. I felt like he had the frame. Right. I felt like from a pitcher perspective, things that we talked about earlier, he had the frame, but I felt like the guys who kind of reminded me of Forrest Whitley a little bit, minus the injuries, so to speak. But when they did pitch in the minors and were very successful, it seemed way too, which I don't know if this is even a thing, but it seemed way too easy. It seemed like they weren't tested enough. And in my experience, the pitchers that just go through the minors like that, and then they get to the majors, it's like going from college football to the NFL. It's just not anywhere close to the same. And so they really, really struggle when they get there. And again, since only had one shot, really, right? He'll get plenty more. And maybe he'll turn it around and do well and stuff. But I was just never – he was always a fade of mine. Never really loved him.
Interesting. So, there are certainly a lot of owners that fade pitching generally. Okay.
Yeah. The whole pin tap argument, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't sound like you're quite saying that, but Rodriguez is a guy whose name's come up on a couple different shows.
Yeah.
As a potential fade, and he's starting to turn it around a little bit in the minors right now. It'll be interesting to see what happens in his next cup of coffee.
Yeah.
I'm always reminded how some of the great pitchers of all time have struggled when they first came up to the majors, right?
Very true.
And I'm not saying in any way that he's going to be one of those dudes, but it does take an extraordinary amount of patience with pitching, because something can click eventually, right? And the guy
help them in the right spot too, right?
Like
pitching coach, right? Teammates,
right. And so you just never know. I mean, this is a kid who has a lot of quality pitches. And maybe it's pitch mix change, or maybe it's just a slight change in grip on a ball, one of his pitches, or just the right amount of confidence or experience. It's like they said about Nuke LaLoosh and Bull Durham. They're going to light you up like a pinball machine when you get up there, right? Just stay cocky and arrogant.
Yep.
That's part of it. So I get the fade on him. I'm not out on him. But I'm
not either. I'm not either.
Yeah. I have zero shares.
Yeah.
He's not a guy I've ever targeted, right? He's no Yuri Perez to me. But, so what other fades do you have?
Yeah. I guess I'll talk about multiple fades, and this is where Brooks Lee comes in.
Right.
Is I fade every single Minnesota Twins prospect. And I don't care who it is. I don't care how much people hype them up. I fade everyone. And the reason I say that, there's a couple reasons. One, I've spent most of my life watching our best prospects come up through the system and do one of two things. Either one, which is more often than not be as good as they were hyped up to be, or two, be as good as they were hyped up to be, but leave us 3 years after they're as good as they're hyped up to be. So I fade all of them because they essentially, at best, we're going to get maybe a few years out of them before they ship them off for something else. And to be fair, some of them have gone on to other teams and done well. More of them have gone on to other teams and not been as successful as they were with us.
Yeah, I'm making a mental note right now, Tyler, to target any Minnesota Twin you have.
And that's the funny thing, right? Is I took Encarnacion Strand from someone, and he literally, within 2 weeks of the trade, got traded to the Reds. And so I was like, this is amazing. This is the best thing that ever could have happened, because he's gone before he comes up. Right. So yeah, I'm a very, very typical pessimist optimist when it comes to the Minnesota Twins. I always want them to succeed and do well, but my expectation is always a 500 record and very minimal success from our farm system.
Fair enough.
So,
Or time on the IL, like a couple of their
true.
best players right now, right?
Or that, yes.
Yeah, the
correct.
Byron Buxton model, right?
Oh my gosh, first
Yeah.
time in years we've had a pitching staff, and half our hitting lineup can't be healthy. So
Yeah, no, the pitching staff's impressive there at the major league level. They've got some good guys.
unbelievable.
Any other fades that you wanted to talk about?
I could just, I mean, well, sure. I got one more who's a former Twin who also went to Cincinnati, Chase Petty, high end kind of pitching prospect. Someone who I didn't love when we picked him. Didn't think he should have been drafted where he was by us. Definitely thought he was overslotted. For very similar reasons, right? We talk about just the basic metrics, and you talk about the height, weight type stuff. Just didn't love him. And I feel like it's kind of showed already, even in the minors. I would not be shocked to see him go to the bullpen at some point.
Right. That's always been a risk. And that was a target. That was a identified risk for Petty when he was coming out of the draft, right?
Exactly.
He might be a future setup man or closer, but maybe not a starting pitcher, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And he's also a dude, as you pointed out, with the height and weight, who had some durability questions around him. Yep. So I get that. He was one of those guys in that draft class that was, on my board, but lower than I think people were willing to, take him. So I have 0 shares of Petty.
Same.
Yeah, as a result,
Same.
right?
It's just no interest.
Yeah, I just moved him down enough. Like, it was like, well, if he's there here, I'll take him. But I'm not reaching for this guy.
Yeah.
Noah Schultz, 6'8", who throws 98 miles an hour. That dude, I'm taking. Yeah, he went up my board. Brendan, he prevented me from having, the 4-team, quad that I like to call it. I've got certain players in my minors that I have in all 4 teams.
Yeah.
And one of them should be Noah Schultz.
Well, it's ironic. I didn't realize this, but I just looked it up because you were talking about Noah Schultz, and so I was looking up his team. I just happened to have his up, and I looked at his team. He has both Grayson Rodriguez and Chase Petty.
There you go. You are casting shade on Brendan every chance you get. I love it, even unintentionally. That is some division. And for those who don't know, Brendan owns the Kansas City Royals and ABL. So this is real AL Central.
It's the greatest.
I like it.
Brendan and I, our rivalry is the I will put it up against any other rivalry in the league. It's great.
That's great. The only other thing I would add to the conversation is that I identified last week, a crush that I had on Jose Urbina, the Tampa Bay Rays pitching prospect, who's all of 17 years old in the CPX. And so far, he's pitched, I think, 4.2 innings, at the CPX, but love him. And incidentally, not the player I was going to talk about, but Dylan Lesko, a guy I traded up for the draft, has his surface stats aren't quite there yet. Again, very small sample size, but if you read the recent Baseball America update on his scouting report, the only word that comes to mind is gushing. Every scouting report I read about Dylan Lesko, they're like, oh my goodness, you hear things about poetry and motion and beauty, perfect. I'm like, okay, this is getting a little Warren-esque. But I'm going to draft this guy and hold on to him.
Love it.
But the guy I was going to identify at tonight's show was Rainer Arias, the outfielder for the Giants, who's 17 years old in the DHL. And he's actually been banged up recently, so he's not played in the last week or so. But if you look at his stats in the DHL, they're out of control.
That's awesome.
Yeah, he's got a 1,300 OPS. He's batting .414. He's out of control. Yeah. What's interesting, there's so many pop-up guys in the DHL, right? But he was very high on my board, but he was a guy who I actually ended up not drafting on a single team out of my 4 leagues. But I had remorse about not rostering him. So I slowly, before the DHL season started, rostering him. Right. And so I by the time the DHL season started, I had him on 3 of my 4 teams. And then he caught fire. Now he's on all 4. Right. I'm like, so this is one of those things where in retrospect, you look like a genius. Yeah. If it all works out, but it was really kind of I didn't draft him, so I wasn't really that smart. Yeah. And then I kind of backed into him because nobody else was paying attention to him. Yeah. So we'll see what happens. But I'm a big Rainer Arias fan. Now I'm a big backer, but we'll see what happens. It's only
awesome.
100 plate appearances or whatever it's been. But God bless him. He's going to be the next star Willie Mays. That's what's going to happen.
There you go. Okay.
No, he actually plays right field. He's not as fast as Willie, but he does have a lot of power. But anyway, listen, Tyler, it's been great to have you on the show. And I think it's always really fascinating to talk to other owners in the league and hear about their perspectives. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And hopefully we can have you on again. I'm very interested, generally hearing about your power rankings at some point. It's not really the topic of this show, but I know it's very popular. ABL to bash you about the power rankings, which I never do. I just appreciate that you're doing it. Thank you. But great to have you on, and good luck to your Twins and the rest of the season.
I appreciate it as well.
Yeah, thank you. And for those listening at home, remember to ABP. Always be prospecting. Talk to you later.
Bye.